I'd like to give a short intro into theoretical or potential theoretical foundation. You might have asked yourself, why is startup financing different to corporate financing? And we had one example from the balance sheet perspective, and the other example is actually on this slide. If you look at corporate financing and the general assumptions people make when they look at corporate financing, the first assumption is there are perfect markets, so there's equal distribution of information, there are no transaction costs, rational individuals, so there's no individual utility function, and the division of financing instruments is at discretion. Everyone can get every financing in every amount, basically. We know also in corporate finance that these are ideal assumptions, and we're going away from those assumptions and look at the consequences and top management team structure and all sorts of things. In entrepreneurial finance, these consequences are very important. And I'd like to go on the right side of the slide right now, since there are two things in entrepreneurial finance that play a big role. The first thing, if you start your startup, you're actually uncertain whether you're going to be successful. You try to gather information. You probably already gathered a lot of information. You might not share all the information with your potential investors. Still, you're an honest person, but you do not have the time to share all the information. So there will probably be an information asymmetry between you having more information and the investor having less information. Might be an information asymmetry vice versa also. You do not have all the information on your investor, and you rely on your investor helping you, and he can't help you, which you didn't know before. So this information asymmetry plays a big role, especially when you talk about those entrepreneurial endeavors facing the high uncertainty. And the second difference, and this is also important, is the divergence of interests. In big corporates, you normally invest into a corporate setting, and the interest of an individual doesn't basically play a role. Not entirely true. Top management team can have an influence, but however, this is very limited. If you look at entrepreneurial companies, if a founder wants to sell his company, company's going to be sold. If a founder doesn't want to sell, company's not going to be sold. Look at Yahoo. They had many offers to sell the company. The founders always said no. But the investors might had the wish to sell the company because they could have made more money. And actually, if you look at investors' business model, buying low, selling high, they have to sell. Some of the investors, especially the equity investors, they have to sell. So it doesn't go in line. And this divergence of interest is the second important issue. And if you look at the foundations of entrepreneurial finance, you have to question the assumptions of the neoclassical finance theory, and actually have to go to a different view, which we call the new institutional economic theory. And the two main differences coming from the right side of the slide are that you can model a divergence of interest and also an information asymmetry, and you have the means and the instruments to reduce divergence of interest and information asymmetry. And actually, this is what is being done by capitalists and also by entrepreneurs in that relationship. So first of all, what the new institutional economic theory says, there's no perfect market. There's positive transaction costs. If you look at investors looking at business plans, these are transaction costs. They might be very high if they want to understand the business. They're rational individuals, however, they maximize their own utility function. And we had the example that the utility function of an entrepreneur versus capitalist can be different, and there's opportunistic behavior. Everyone maximizes his own utility function and might not think about the other person extensively. So if you run into such a situation, and if you know your investor has different interests compared to you, you might want to think about ways to align the interest. If the investor faces a startup and wants to know more about the startup, he might want to reduce the information asymmetry. And actually, the new institutional economic theory provides instruments for that. And entrepreneurial finance can be based on that theory, especially the principal agent theory as part of this theoretical stream. And what is a principal agent theory in general? So there is a principal. In our case, it might be an investor. And there's an agent. In our case, it might be the entrepreneur. And the investor gives the entrepreneur money. That's the contract they make. However, the investor knows that there is information asymmetry, limited rationality, so he doesn't know everything about the entrepreneur. So he wants to find out about what drives the entrepreneur in terms of, does he really want to sell the business when I have to get out of the business in order to realize my capital gains and such. This leads to the second point, the so-called opportunism, which can be behavior the one and the other side doesn't like from the one and the other side. It might be not legal, but in most cases it's just behavior which differs between the two sides. So again, maybe the agent, the entrepreneur, spends too much money on things the capitalist didn't want to invest in, for example. And they depend on each other, meaning they have this contract as I described. And in this relationship, contracts between capitalists and entrepreneurs are made. And this is why looking at entrepreneurial finance in that perspective is very important. So take an example. You have someone who's giving you, we had Peter Thiel, who was giving 400,000 euro to Mark Zuckerberg. 10% of the roughly 10% of the business. How does Peter Thiel make money? Well, he has to sell his 10% share later on. And he has to know that Mark Zuckerberg is building a business which he is able to sell, or at least there is some kind of exit mechanism for him. He has to check on Mark whether he wants the same thing. But sometimes you find entrepreneurs, and actually we have them at our technical university, who love their product so much that they want to run their company forever. And the perfect example also is Yahoo. The founders wanted to run the company forever independently. This is why they denied all the offers they had to sell their company. If you have an entrepreneur like this, and you know that the entrepreneur is like this, you have to have a contract that at least allows you to sell your shares. And this is why looking at, for example, contracts in the entrepreneurial finance setting on the basis of this theory is very, very helpful to understand the relationship. So the main thing we are doing in the course right now is modeling and trying to understand the two sides, the difference between the two sides, the dependency between the two sides, and the information asymmetry between the two sides, in order to be able to, for a startup CFO, to be prepared on a capitalist, what he wants, and vice versa, also for a capitalist to prepare for the entrepreneur, and having a good understanding on what could happen in this relationship.